Well, we're going to go ahead and get started for this evening. I'm Corey Thompson. If you don't know me, I'm the program director for the Theological Symposium, and I appreciate all of you being here. I know we've got some that are still out there that are registering and coming in. If you have not registered, I want to encourage you to do so. That is a costing thing to register. We just like to have your name and your information, put you on our email list and stuff like that. So please do that. If you haven't registered, please go ahead and do that. But I do want to thank all of you for coming and being here tonight. We're going to have two presentations tonight, and then starting tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, we'll be having more presentations all throughout the day. There'll be 7 of them. So be sure to come back tonight for that. I do want to thank all the presenters that are going to be presenting. Some of them are here. Some of them will be here tomorrow. Appreciate your hard work. Appreciate you taking the time to do that, the time to be here, and to present and answer questions for us based on your work. I also want to thank Randall for their hospitality and for hosting this event. There's a lot of people that have worked hard to make this happen. I want to especially thank Haley Miller, who is the president's executive assistant. She's done a lot of work. And then Miss Pat and Tony, who are responsible for all the refreshments there. So want to thank them and thank my dad. I've been abusing him for the last few months to get this thing done the way I want it done. So I appreciate his work as well. At this time, I'm going to introduce the chairman of our commission, Dr. Matthew Penson, and he's going to come and say a few words of welcome, and he's also going to pray for us after that.
Thank you, Brother Corey. It is a delight to welcome you to this Commission for Theological Integrity Theological Symposium. And it's always great to come out to Randall, and you always roll out the red carpet for us, and we have a wonderful time. I've had many a good Van's Pig Stand barbecues out here and many good late night meals at Brahms, and enjoyed some very good theological discussion while doing all that. But I see a lot of my good old Symposium pals out in the audience today. And it's so good. We're going to have a great time coming together around thinking about God's Word and thinking about the implications of God's Word and the apostolic tradition and the apostolic gospel. And that's what we're here for. And I want to say thank you to the Commission for Theological Integrity, to our secretary, Dr. Kevin Hester. You've already heard from our program chairman, Brother Corey Thompson. We also have here Dr. Jackson Watts and also Brother Rodney Holloman, who will be coming and introducing our first speaker. And so on their behalf, I want to welcome you to this symposium, and I want to thank Randall for hosting us. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our God, we thank you for this time we have together, and we thank you for your word, the word of truth. We thank you to your Spirit, who through the illumining power of the Spirit brings us into all truth. And we're thankful that we can trust your word, that it is inerrant and infallible and authoritative for our faith and for our practice. So we pray tonight as we listen, and tomorrow as we listen to these papers, and as we interact with them, as we engage in Q&A and discussion, and even during the times of our breaks when we discuss with each other, we pray that there'll be hallowed discussions that lift up your truth, that lift up your word, as we see in your word and gospel. We thank you for Randall, for their hosting and their nice hospitality to us, and we pray your blessings on this meeting through Christ our Lord. Amen. Again, we want to thank Brother Bob Thompson. And I can tell you, over the years, it has been a joy to interact with this gentleman. He's been so supportive of the commission and so supportive of our meetings, not only coming to the meetings here at Randall for many years and even decades, but coming over to Nashville and to Gallatin for our meetings over there at Welch. He's been a solid supporter of this symposium and our commission, and I want to welcome him now to give you the Randall welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Pinson. I have been bossed around quite a bit by my son the last 2 months, and what I have discovered, I'm a more obedient than he was as a child. I want to say thank you for coming. It is our privilege to host this theological symposium on our campus. We do appreciate the Commission of Theological Integrity, as well as presenters who worked very hard to prepare for this night. So we are very thankful that you're here and you're a part of this symposium. I just want to share a few things with you that tomorrow we'll be providing lunch for you, so we hope that you'll stay. Also, tomorrow night we'll provide supper for you. I'd like to invite all the presenters, the participants, our faculty and staff, and our students to be a part of that supper tomorrow night, simply so that we can get to know one another. So I hope that you will stay and be a part of that. I also want to say that I'm very thankful for Pat and Tony Miller for their presentation of the refreshments tonight that you'll enjoy at break and after the break. I appreciate the hard work that they do. Also, you may not be a coffee drinker or water, but our cafeteria is right here out this door to the right. You can go in the cafeteria. We have a Coke machine there, and you can have all the Diet Coke you'd like to have, okay? So we're very thankful to have you here tonight. We appreciate you being a part of that. If you have anything that you want, any question you have to ask Corey.
Good evening. My name is Kevin Hester. I serve as Secretary for the Commission for Theological Integrity, and I'd like to express my welcome. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate your time, and I am excited, as I am sure you are excited, about all the many papers that we're going to hear read. The first paper that we're going to hear is The Evilness of Evil, Reassessing the Problem of Evil in Contemporary Philosophical Dialogue. It's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Denny Kuhn. There are a lot of parallels, interestingly, between his tenure here at Randall and my tenure at Welch. We both started in 2003. We both went to did master's degrees at Reformed seminaries, which is an interesting experience for someone who's not coming from that tradition. But he is the professor of philosophy, theology, apologetics, and ethics, as well as the program director for the program in letters here at Randall University. He holds a bachelor's degree from Ball State, his MAR from Reformed Theological Seminary, and a PhD in philosophy from Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. He is a robustly published author, denominationally and abroad. You could tell by his topic the way in which he focuses upon philosophical prolegomena, and yet the way in which these central questions of life ultimately impact ministry and our Christian worldview. So I'm excited to hear what Dr. Kuhn has to share with us. He and his wife, Hillary, their daughters, Sophia and Abigail, are members of Newcastle Free Will Baptist Church in Newcastle, Oklahoma, and they live right here, close by, Noble, Oklahoma. So, Dr. Kuhn, welcome.
Greetings. It's so good to be here with you all. I appreciate you being here this evening. I thank my colleagues, I see some out there, for showing up tonight, and a number of my students. It's amazing when if you mention the words extra credit, what kind of a turnout you will get as a result. Again, the title of my paper is The Evilness of Evil, Reassessing the Problem of Evil in Contemporary Philosophical Dialogue. Given the length of my paper and the time constraints, I will not be reading it in its entirety. It's a favor to you. So I will, and especially for the benefit of those who are following along, the other presenters, anyone else who happens to have a paper copy of the presentation, I will be signaling to you at different points certain sections that we'll be skipping in order to respect the time constraints. So beginning here with my introduction. For anyone who has read deeply moving novels such as Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, William Styron's Sophie's Choice, or Elie Wiesel's The Trial of God, or if one is simply aware of recent news reports, it is painfully obvious that evil is ubiquitous in the human experience. Scores of people have directly suffered through great tragedies in their own lives, including losing a loved one to a ravaging disease, being the victim of a violent attack, or incurring loss from a destructive natural disaster. Cases like these raise the age-old question of the problem of evil. Why do bad things happen to good people? Is the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God compatible with the fact of evil? How could a good and loving God exist when so much evil and suffering exists in the world? Whether intellectually or emotionally, many find it incredibly difficult to reconcile the existence of the God of Christian theism with the enormous quantity, intensity, and in some cases, apparently gratuitous nature of the evils that occur. Moreover, atheists have marshaled the problem of evil in their case against theism and in defense of metaphysical naturalism. The existence of evil has been considered the atheist's strongest evidence in their arsenal against the rationality of belief in God. In recent decades, the so-called new atheists have capitalized on the apparent illogicality between the existence of God and evil in their efforts to evangelize and crusade for new converts to atheism. They have sought to revive the problem of evil, using it to rail against belief in Christianity specifically, but also religion in general, for all of the immorality, injustice, and evil in the world. Beyond the new atheists, various atheist philosophers of religion have developed more sophisticated philosophical arguments from evil against belief in God and Christianity. When one sincerely considers the vast numbers of people suffering at any given moment, questions concerning the relationship between God and evil are reasonable and to be expected. Such questions should even be welcomed as an opportunity for deeper reflection on the meaning, purpose, and value of human life, the nature of reality, and so forth. Additionally, they invite a closer examination of what I'm calling here this evening the evilness of evil. That peculiar quality of certain especially heinous acts of evil that evokes deep-seated moral outrage. Unfortunately, it often takes dreadful events to rudely awaken humanity from its desensitized slumber to the fact of evil. Each day, people tragically suffer and die and do not make the news headlines. But there's something about the appalling mass killing of innocent school children by a deranged shooter, or the gruesome beheadings of innocent aid workers by radical extremist groups, or the quivering voices of rape victims as they recount their terrifying encounters with their brutal attackers, all of which seize the human heart, forcing us to face up to the evilness of evil. These heartbreaking examples serve as shocking reminders that something is indeed terribly wrong with the world. Generally speaking, this paper examines the contemporary discussion of the problem of evil, including 4 key areas. First, a critical analysis of the popular tactics of the new atheists in appealing to the problem of evil as an argument against the rationality of belief in God. Second, an assessment of some of the more sophisticated approaches taken to the problem of evil by philosophers of religion or philosophical theologians. Third, a careful consideration of some fundamental questions about the nature of evil and their implications for responding to the challenge of the problem of evil. And finally, a proposal for a different strategy for approaching the problem of evil from an apologetic standpoint. More specifically, this paper argues that evil is a theism-dependent concept, and therefore the fact of evil's existence, far from disproving the existence of God, actually entails God's existence. Now, this next section of the paper we're going to skip over, again for time's sake. Notice the heading there, the new atheism, the evil of religion, and that continues over for a few pages. But if I could have those of you following along skip ahead to page 11. And I'd be thrilled if you went back and reviewed what I wrote in that section where I'm critiquing the various works of the so-called new atheists, figures like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris. You may be familiar with a number of those names. But again, for time's sake, we won't get into that this evening. On page 11, notice the heading, Contemporary Philosophical Approaches to the Problem of Evil. Starting with the logical problem of evil. One of the obvious problems for the new atheists and popular atheism in general is their lack of philosophical sophistication and interaction with the problem of evil in the contemporary literature and the philosophy of religion. Generally, philosophers of religion distinguish between the intellectual and the personal problems of evil, the former being more academic and theoretical, while the latter addressing real instances of suffering in people's lives. Within the general category of the intellectual problem of evil, philosophers further distinguish between the logical and the evidential forms of the problem. This crucial distinction seems completely lost on the new atheists as they continually avail themselves of the widely abandoned logical problem of evil in their attacks on theistic belief. Based on this version of the problem, atheists argued a logical contradiction exists in the following set of beliefs. First, that God exists. Second, that God is omnipotent. Third, that God is omniscient. Fourth, that God is wholly or perfectly good. And finally, that evil exists. The goal is to demonstrate a logical incompatibility between God and evil such that if evil exists, then God cannot exist, or God lacks one of the attributes identified in propositions 1 through 4. Despite the argument's long pedigree in the history of philosophy, from Epicurus to David Hume to J.L. Mackie, there's virtually a consensus among contemporary philosophers of religion that it fails to demonstrate a logical contradiction between the coexistence of the God of classical theism and evil. Nevertheless, the new atheists, apparently oblivious to the contemporary discussion of these issues, continually resort to this particular version of the argument. Next, what's called the evidential problem of evil. The evidential problem of evil does not seek to establish that the existence of evil is logically incompatible with God's existence, but only that the evidence of evil makes God's existence less probable. Hence, it is not a deductive, but an inductive argument from evil. For example, William Rowe, the most famous proponent of this strategy, writes, "My own inclination is to think that given the horrendous evils in our world, that there is no God. For surely if there were a God, he would wish to provide us with strong reasons to think that he exists. Given that horrendous evils in our world, both natural and moral, seem to provide us with reason to doubt his existence." Accordingly, some philosophers set out to determine the probability or improbability of God's existence based on the facts about actual world evils. The evidential approach appeals to a variety of factors about evil as probabilistic evidence for doubting God's existence, including the quantity of evil, the distribution of evil, the quality of evil, and the seemingly gratuitous nature of certain instances of evil and suffering among human beings as well as animals. Despite the numerous challenges based on the many versions of the argument from evil, a number of carefully reasoned, cogent responses to each of them is available in the form of either a defense or a theodicy. The basic difference between the two types of response depends on who is believed to bear the burden of proof in the argument. When responding to the logical problem of evil, the theist only need offer a defense in order to establish that there is no logical incompatibility between the existence of God and evil. One only needs show that it is possible that God has some morally sufficient reason for allowing evil to exist. On this strategy, the reason need only be logically possible. It does not even have to be posited as true. By contrast, in proposing a theodicy, the theist attempts to provide a justification for God's permitting evil to exist, and the particular justification is offered as a true solution to the problem. These justifications are diverse and include, for example, the free will theodicy, the natural law theodicy, the soul-making theodicy, the best of all possible worlds, or the Leibnizian theodicy, the heavenly bliss theodicy, among others, each containing a variety of formulations. The general theme undergirding most theodicies is the appeal to some greater good that God accomplishes through permitting the existence of evil in the world, and thus exonerating God of any blame or charge of wrongdoing. In summary, there are a number of possible philosophical solutions to the intellectual problem of evil in either the form of a defense or a theodicy, and there are abundant treatments of these proposed solutions in the philosophical literature on the subject. Many find these responses satisfying in answering the atheist's challenge of the argument from evil. Of course, some do not. Even so, there is an arguably more fruitful way of responding to what has been considered the greatest challenge to Christian theism based on the problem of evil. And this next or last major section of the paper is what I would consider really the heart and soul of my paper here, this presentation. So please follow along very carefully. A game changer, reassessing the challenge. Bertrand Russell, one of the most famous atheists of the 20th century, in his book titled Why I Am Not a Christian, pointed to the facts of evil and injustice in the world as strong evidence against the existence of God. He wrote that a, quote, scientific person would argue about the universe that, here we find in this world a great deal of injustice, and so far as that goes, that is a reason for supposing that justice does not rule in the world. And therefore, so far as it goes, it affords a moral argument against deity and not in favor of one, end quote. By contrast, C.S. Lewis, one of the most celebrated Christian thinkers of the same century, in his classic work, Mere Christianity, also pointed to the facts of evil and injustice, but expounded how they led him to conclude the exact opposite of Russell. Lewis explains, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sins. Consequently, Lewis says, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there is no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. And this last line of his is very significant for the rest of what I'm going to get into here. He concludes, dark would be a word without meaning. Dark would be a word without meaning. Who is right, Russell or Lewis, the atheist or the Christian theist? Arguably, Lewis is correct for the reason that his brilliant prose underscores, which offers us an insight often completely missed or at least underappreciated in much of the contemporary treatment of the problem of evil. Lewis elucidates how the very concept of evil is theism dependent. In other words, the concept derives its meaning from a theistic metaphysic, which entails a morally charged universe. Apart from this framework, the form of the word may be used, but it is devoid of any objective content. Evil is a theism-dependent concept as much as other concepts, such as creation ex nihilo, sin, salvation, final judgment, rewards and punishments in an afterlife, and many others. Each of these notions presupposes, ontologically, if not epistemologically, the existence of God in order to have the objective meaning they possess. This is not to say that someone must believe in God before being able to attest to the real experience of evil. On the contrary, it is to say that, metaphysically speaking, the categories of good and evil represent absolute, objective, universal valuations, if and only if there exists a morally perfect personal being to ground such values. Nonetheless, routinely in the philosophical literature, the notion of evil is handled as if it were a metaphysically neutral concept, a concept equally available to both a theistic and a naturalistic framework. Consequently, it is commonly argued that one only need to assess which framework, theism or naturalism, on balance, offers the better, more plausible explanation of evil's existence by weighing the arguments on both sides of the debate. Thus, literally, volumes of material have been written in the form of highly specialized philosophical arguments in the attempt to demonstrate that a particular defense or theodicy or some combination of the two either succeeds or fails to resolve the problem of evil. It is often just assumed that the theist should bear the burden of proof in accounting for evil's existence. Thus, it is not unusual to read philosophers of religion, believers and non-believers alike, speaking as if evil counts as evidence against theism, unless a well-defended defense or theodicy is put forward or sustained against atheist arguments from evil. This approach takes for granted, however, and wrongly concedes that the naturalist has an epistemic right to the concept of evil, while the theist is left with the heavy burden of reconciling theism with the fact of evil. This is mistaken in that it fails to call into question the atheist's employment of a notion that could only have objective meaning on theism. The atheist's use of the concept of evil amounts to a kind of conceptual exploitation. Apart from a theistic framework, evil is a term empty of objective significance, an overinflated locution for what on naturalism could be only consistently expressed in either ordinary, mundane terms or sterile scientific ones. The way evil is spoken of by both theists and atheists alike entails a particular nature of evil, which cannot be accounted for in a naturalistic framework. Naturalism lacks the prerequisite metaphysical and conceptual structure for evil. Evil is a category, like sin, not available to the atheist on the atheist's own terms. In the film God on Trial, a moving drama about the suffering of Jews at Auschwitz during the Holocaust, a group of Jewish prisoners decides to hold a mock trial of God in absentia to determine whether or not God is to blame for Jewish suffering at the hands of their Nazi oppressors. At one point in the film's intensely emotional dialogue, one of the Jewish prisoners asks another to consider what evil is if God is an impersonal being. The character Ezra, speaking of the Jewish suffering at the hands of the Nazis, states, "The mistake is to make this personal. This is not personal." Mordecai responds, "Can I ask you, Ezra, do you see any use for a God who is not personal? Do you know what a God who is not personal is? It's weather. That's all, just weather." In the absence of God, evil loses its deeply personal character, and it no longer reflects a horrid corruption of an inherent moral order within the world. Instead, it is reduced to an impersonal, natural part of the world, a part of the way things are, instead of a perversion or distortion of the way things ought to be. Evil then is no longer evil, but an illusion, a misappropriation of an extravagant term without any real referent. The naturalization of evil means the loss of the evilness of evil, that peculiar quality variously captured in words like atrocious, awful, dreadful, ghastly, grave, heinous, hideous, horrendous, horrific, repulsive, revolting, terrible, etc. Either such terms are truly expressive of a non-physical moral quality of behaviors and events that represent violations of an objective moral order, or they only express the subjective feelings and responses of the people emoting them. If the former, then this demonstrates the theism dependence of the concept of evil. But if the latter, then evil is reduced to a mere statistical deviation, anomaly, eccentricity, irregularity, or oddity in nature. It's weather. That's all, just weather. The truth is, what we call evil would lack that peculiar quality of evilness without an absolute personal standard of goodness by which to measure it. Evil represents a ghastly violation, a radical departure from an inherent moral order to the universe, the way things should or ought to be. But such a moral order is not possible unless the universe is created by a perfectly good God who established its moral structure. Contrary to the atheist charge that evil is somehow incompatible with the existence of God, it is only on God's existence that evil can exist or have any objective meaning whatsoever. Whenever atheism appeals to the facts of evil, it is operating on borrowed capital from the theistic metaphysic and worldview. Accordingly, the disarming and sobering encounter with brazen acts of evil in our experience, which rightly evokes moral outrage in us all, leads to an ironic twist for the atheist. Rather than evil serving as evidence against God, the shocking reality of evil actually offers one of the most deeply compelling reasons for establishing the existence of God. The following account, again taken from the film God on Trial, is part of a dialogue concerning the horrible atrocities that took place in the Holocaust during World War II. In this recounting of events, after a heated exchange concerning a glibly proffered free will theodicy to explain why God allowed the Jews to suffer, the Jewish prisoner Liebel is asked to explain to his fellow prisoners how the Nazis forced him to make the choice between his own children to be taken away from him. The dialogue proceeds as follows. Schmidt, the answer to this is very simple, he says. The answer is free will. Yes, there is evil in the world because God gave man free will and he chose to do evil with it. It's very simple. Moshe, free will? Free will my arse, I'll give you free will. Where is Liebel? Liebel. I'm come from Hogan. It's near Aachen. When the Einsatzgruppen came, they smashed the doors to the synagogue, they burned the Torah and the Ark, and then they herded us inside. We thought that they were going to burn us there and then. If only they had. They took the children away. I have 3 sons. The oldest one will be 7 now, and they're so beautiful. That doesn't matter. They put the children in a truck. I ran after them and I shouted, please, please, give me my sons. Give me my sons. And this officer, he heard me. He stopped and said, which are yours? I thought he was going to give them back. I showed him my 3 sons. The oldest one, he was crying, and the other 2, no, that's not it. He said to me, they're 3 handsome boys. I'll tell you what you can do. Choose one. Pick one. Pick one and you can keep him with you. And the boys, they heard him. They put out their hands. They were so frightened. They were reaching out to me and they were saying, please pick me, pick me. This gentleman, he said that we always have a choice. Which should I have chosen? The youngest? The oldest? The weakest? The strongest? Which should I have chosen? Excuse me, I don't want free will. I want my son's. You talk about free will. Where was my will then? What choice did I have? That officer, he had a choice, not me. Where was my free will? This account of such unspeakable evil reveals a further, more systemic failure of metaphysical naturalism that is especially evident when one considers the existential thrust of the problem of evil. In addition to the standard logical and evidential approaches to the problem, some philosophers also speak of the existential problem of evil. This very personal side of the issue is often missed by the more abstract nature of the heavily analytical approach. Nonetheless, it is absolutely essential for properly understanding all the multifaceted nature of the problem. Oftentimes, philosophers accentuate the intellectual or rational elements of the problem at the expense of the weightier experiential and emotional factors involved. The dialectical jousting occasionally results in somewhat impersonal rationalizations of the problem on the part of both theistic and atheistic accounts. And yet, something about certain forms and shapes that evil takes, as one writer puts it, makes a person want to shake her fist at the sky. This kind of imagery simply does not fit with naturalism. On a naturalistic metaphysic, what can possibly account for the deeply personal sense of moral outrage, the clamorous outcry against severe acts of injustice, the somber understanding that something is terribly wrong with the world and that things ought to be otherwise? It is this existential, more emotive and personal aspect of the problem of evil that is especially relevant here. Consider another poignant example of the sobering awareness of the evilness of evil in human experience. This time, the example is taken from George Steiner's intellectual autobiography titled Errata. With powerful emotion, he writes, "There are those who tear out the eyes of living children, who shoot children in the eyes, who beat animals across their eyes. These facts overwhelm me with desolate loathing. At the maddening center of despair is the insistent instinct of a broken contract, of an appalling and specific cataclysm. In the futile scream of the child and the mute agony of the tortured animal sounds the background noise of a horror after creation. Something, how helpless language can be, has gone hideously wrong. I am possessed as by a midnight clarity by the intuition of the fall." Only some such happening, irretrievable to reason, can make intelligible, though always near to unbearable, the actualities of our history on this wasted earth. The revolting character of evil in this case cries out for an explanation that can only be fittingly captured on theism. For the atheist lacks the needed metaphysical framework for speaking meaningfully of heinous or appalling or horrendous evils. On naturalism, what do such terms even mean? Such visceral reactions to and evaluations of the so-called evil would be reducible to nothing more than mere subjective emotions and attitudes, expressions of one's feelings toward a morally indifferent, purposeless, and meaningless universe. But the terms frequently used, even by atheist thinkers, to describe certain kinds of evil suggest a profound wrongness with the way the world is, a felt wrongness that simply is irreconcilable in naturalism. If God does not exist, then there is no way the world ought to be. and one's feelings are neither congruous nor incongruous with any real objective moral values or obligations whatsoever. On naturalism, the worst one can say about a person's attitude or behavior is that they run against the grain of cultural or societal norms, or depart from certain agreed upon ethical constructs, but nothing that could justifiably evoke moral shock and outrage. Certain attitudes and behavior may be politically incorrect, contrary to popular opinion, and thus might draw the ire of public scrutiny, but this is very different from claiming that someone's actions or attitudes are wicked, vile, or revolting, independent of what the majority of a population happens to think. Atheism simply cannot avail itself of these existential responses to occasions of evil. It would seem then that atheist philosophers have proven too much, and by doing so have landed in a philosophical catch-22. Atheists point to evil as evidence against theism, but at the same time, many atheists also try to neutralize the moral argument for God's existence by rejecting the reality of objective moral values and duties. But this is a proverbial case of the attempt to have one's cake and eat it too. Without the fact of evil, there is no problem of evil, and without objective morality, there are no absolute categories of good or evil. Either way, atheism falls on its own sword. If atheists do acknowledge the existence of evil, ironically, this leads to the falsification of atheism. If atheists do not acknowledge the genuine nature of objective morality, then the problem of evil vanishes, and atheists lose what historically has been thought to be their primary evidence against God's existence. Thus, when it comes to conceding the existence of evil in the world, atheists are damned if they do and damned if they don't. Either way, a damnable philosophy. Accordingly, this makes the atheist arguments from evil against theism rather farcical. Far from evil providing evidence against the existence of God, the reality of evil makes for incredibly strong evidence for the reality of God. The atheist is not entitled to the presumption of evil in a godless universe, and the existence of evil, no matter the shape or form or degree or intensity, could never amount to contrary evidence for theism. Moreover, atheistic protests against real-life cases of evil only make sense on the background of the personal God of theism. As theologian Miroslav Volf forcibly puts the point, quote, "I believe that you can protest against the evil in the world only if you believe in a good God. Otherwise, the protest doesn't make sense. I protest with God against God," unquote. Furthermore, the logical, evidential, and existential problems of evil take on renewed force, but against atheism, not theism. This is so because the problem of evil, no matter the version, only has force if evil exists. Since evil is theism dependent, if it exists, then evil logically, evidentially, and existentially entails the being of God. Thus, surprisingly for some, the fact of evil provides an ultimate defeater for naturalism. What is more, Christian theism has an incredibly decisive advantage over atheism in its ability to actually explain evil. Rather than explaining evil away by reducing it to some non-moral category, theism exhibits great explanatory power and scope when it comes to accounting for the nature of evil. This is significant not only for the intellectual problem, but more vitally, also the personal problem of evil. Whereas the atheist must explain away certain acts of moral evil as some form of psychological abnormality, imbalance, maladjustment, or natural evil as some kind of environmental misfortune, bad luck, anomaly. The theist has the advantage of saving the appearances and acknowledging such evils for what they are intuited and felt to be in all of their sheer horror, wickedness, and fallenness. God's existence cannot be denied without radically redefining evil in a way that it loses its properly basic meaning. The elimination of God abandons the concept, the very possibility of evil along with him. As E. E. Cummings poetically expressed the problem, Jehovah buried, Satan dead. On atheism, evil has to be naturalized, secularized, and psychologized in order to fit the Procrustean bed of metaphysical naturalism. Evil is depersonalized, demythologized, and sterilized in such a way that purported justifications of it become, if not question-begging, both intellectually and personally dissatisfying. This is not a trivial point. Recall the line, "Other than that, Mrs. Kennedy, how was your trip to Dallas?" Some problems are systemically fatal for certain views, and for that reason should not be dismissed or ignored. This seems to be the case for atheism in its abject failure at grounding the metaphysics of evil. Whereas theism, though not requiring its existence, is able to fit evil into its theistic framework, the only framework powerful and large enough to explain evil without explaining it away. Now I offer a proposal for proceeding. As stated earlier, atheists operate on borrowed capital when employing the problem of evil in their efforts to refute theism. Unfortunately, many Christian philosophers and apologists lend atheists the capital without bothering to ask them to give an account on naturalism for their use of the concept. However, the time is well overdue for calling in the atheist debt. Christian theists should not allow atheists to trade on the concept as if it were common metaphysical coinage. Nevertheless, many theists do, and in fact, some seem to agree that evil could serve as real evidence against God, or that theism somehow hangs in the balance based on its success or failure in the face of atheistic arguments from evil. This is a critical mistake, an egregious error, because it makes or grants the assumption that the various horrific cases of evil delineated above would retain the same peculiar quality of evilness even if God did not exist. Many theists, and especially theodicists, write as if the concept of evil remains fully intact with or without God in the picture. But clearly, the postulating of the existence or non-existence of God should be a total ontological game changer regarding the nature of evil and likewise the conceptualization of evil. The Christian theist wrongly bequeaths too much to the atheist when discussing the concept of evil as if it were metaphysically neutral. Rather than ceding the atheist's use of the concept, the theist should uncompromisingly remind the atheist, despite all pretensions to the contrary, of the nihilistic implications of a naturalistic worldview. Richard Dawkins, in what is probably the most consistent thing he has written about these implications, emphatically declares, "The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference." Such extreme, counterintuitive statements about reality may be too much to stomach for some more philosophically sophisticated atheists, yet would still follow logically from a commitment to naturalism. Accordingly, the theist, without blushing or budging, hemming or hawing, should confront the inherent nihilism of metaphysical naturalism head on with the facts of experience regarding the reality of evil. Instead of Christian theists flinching and defaulting to a defensive posture in responding to the problem of evil, they should turn the tables around on the atheists by assuming a stronger position of offense. The best defense is a good offense. Now, this recommendation for a more direct assault on atheism with the evidence of evil is not original, but it is only hinted to, even an afterthought, in most treatments of the problem of evil by Christian theists, including prominent theologians, philosophers, and apologists. Hence, this paper proposes a different tactic for proceeding on the issue, one that makes this offensive strategy a regular procedure in addressing the problem of evil in philosophical and theological discourse. While admittedly, theists have some difficult theological tangles to straighten out concerning God's relationship to evil, nonetheless, the real problem of evil, accounting for the very fact of evil's existence, is a problem for the atheist, not the theist. Tell you what, I'm going to jump ahead here, if you would, those of you following along with me, to the page 30, and the heading there, the apologetic value of evil. Again, the theist, or the atheist rather, has proven too much based on the argument from evil. The acknowledgement of the existence of evil, or of real objective evil, entails the falsity of atheism and the truth of theism. Moreover, this means theists should reclaim an argument from evil for their apologetic repertoire. Alongside the popular versions of the cosmological, teleological, moral, and even ontological theistic arguments, the Christian apologist can also appeal to a theistic version of the argument from evil, even if only as a subspecies of the moral argument, in maintaining the positive apologetic case for God's existence. This deductive argument can be stated simply as follows. Premise 1, if God does not exist, then evil does not exist. Premise 2, evil exists. Therefore, the conclusion, God exists. Presented in logical, evidential, and existential terms, this argument makes a profoundly strong case for classical theism. Even more importantly, the Christian defender of the faith can proclaim the cross of Jesus Christ as demonstrating the love and justice of God in the face of evil. This gospel message of God's great victory includes the final, ultimate defeat of evil in all its forms in the eschaton, when he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away, John writes in Revelation 21:4. In the agony of the cross, God demonstrates both the seriousness with which he takes the problem of evil and the depths of his love for humanity. God reveals in the cross that he is not indifferent to human suffering. Rather, he cares so much for humanity that he was personally willing to endure suffering himself in all its misery and pain. Through his own suffering, God was reconciling the world to himself for the forgiveness of sins through faith in Jesus Christ and the future abolishment of evil from the world. Hence, in Jesus' death and resurrection, one finds hope for a new creation where all evil and suffering will be eradicated, and God's world will not only be restored, but glorified. As the Apostle Paul proclaims, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." Romans 8:18. And judging by the clock, that's probably a good stopping point. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Yeah. Adam's good to see you.
So I'm sympathetic with the project. So just to get that out there, I like it. I like especially on the quality, the noted quality, and the language of Jesus, right? I think that's a plus here. And I'm curious. I'm wondering if the atheist has some fairly not obviously defeated moves here. So it seems like you're criticizing two things. One of them is not having an objective ground, right? And the second is being able to explain the emotions of experience and the language of. Well, would it be possible to say something like it's that you got diamonistic virtue theory, right? That situates, gives an objective ground to morality and human flourishing, and combine that with a story like that our language is expressing our emotion, but that our emotion, given certain equals, is conditioned. For instance, someone who has worked in the slaughterhouse all their lives is going to have a different emotional experience at the death of an animal than a lifelong being. That makes sense?
Yeah, I believe
And
so.
so that might explain, the words seem to indicate they be just, or the words seem to indicate they be just,
Well, two things that come to mind. One, I mean, it's rather easy to throw out terms like eudaimonistic and virtue, but I would want to nail down more specifically what the grounding is that the atheist is appealing to. Sam Harris does something very similar to what you're describing in terms of human flourishing. You read his book on the moral landscape. He puts it in terms of well-being. And I addressed this earlier in the paper in the section we had to skip, but he even acknowledges what really becomes the Achilles heel to his own position was that you can have two groups that have both attained the exact same level of human flourishing or well-being. One is selfless, practices humility. The other is sadomasochistic, practices various forms of torture among minority populations and others. And yet they can attain an equal degree of well-being and human flourishing. And so I think what that shows is that this wishy-washy sort of criterion of human flourishing or well-being isn't carefully or more precisely defined enough in order to exclude certain ways of objectifying certain individuals that might contribute to, the whole, the greater good for the greatest number, a utilitarian sort of ethic. As far as the emotions, that side of it, I think the problem there for the atheist is that what you get is nothing but emotive responses, right? All the terminology, the language I use there, that morally charged language, I don't think I'm in a position to have to defend or justify the moral outrage coupled with that language. I think on the atheist view, I just be willing to concede that you're right. In a naturalistic framework, that is nothing more than cultural, sociocultural kinds of responses that are engendered within us in our particular context and environment. And in that case, the kind of recoiling reaction of disgust or distaste that one had, like myself, I'm not a hunter. I remember the first time I went to visit some friends who were hunting, and one of them had a deer strung up that they had just killed. And when I saw that, I mean, I about fainted. I mean, the disgust, the smell and everything. Well, you would have to say on the atheist point of view, that's no different than the kind of recoiling, disdainful disgust that you have when you read the latest news account of some small child who's been brutally tortured to death. And I think just gauging the room's response to my very example proves my point, that there's a difference, and we all recognize that difference. And so the burden of proof then is on the atheist to account for that in their atheistic framework. Thank you for that, Adam. Please don't hold back. Yes, Mr. Myers. And yes. I mean, fair enough. If what they're offering is an internal criticism, and they're wanting to see how we can measure up to that internal criticism, that's one thing. But then there's the reality of the fact of evil in our experience that I would want to shift that burden right back over onto their side. And that's why I included very intentionally in this presentation some rather moving accounts that I knew as soon as you heard them, it's that punch to the gut, visceral kind of response that I think reveals truth. It reveals truth that is gauged at the level of the moral conscience. And I think we need to demand that the atheists offer some kind of explanation for that. And I'm convinced that they can't, not on their own terms. You started to. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'll do that.
Could you talk quite a bit about the concept of consensus as it develops? Lewis mentioned this idea of a herd mentality, this concept of moral law. You reference a project related to the sentencing of individuals who were determined to commit particularly heinous crimes and the way in which they're trying to determine that. I think you referenced constantly
Yes.
the ways in which you look at the development of consensus. Could you just say a little more about that? Because I in line with your overall thesis, because I think that it would be helpful for us to get a sense of that in the context of a postmodern world where there's this sense that evil is more subjective than objective.
Yeah, and to put it, since you referenced Lewis, to put it in his terms, what that reduces down to is morality is nothing more than a social convention. The various norms that we operate by in terms of these thoughts of this being right or this being wrong is something that's enculturated within us from adults within our experience as we're raised and in the particular environment within which we grow up. And so we're merely patterning the moral ideals that have been imposed upon us by those within society. And the problem that you encounter there is that although there are lots of things that could be put into the category of social conventions that don't necessarily have moral implications, but what this opens the door to when you put morality into that category is that you can very easily conceive of situations in which the Nazis won World War II. And now they're the dominating force within society or the culture. And we don't have to go back to World War II for those kinds of examples. We can look in our modern day, different places around the world, and even within our own country, where certain things become normative in that social construct sort of sense, but they're not really absolutely objectively normative. They're subjective at the end of the day. They're subject to change, depending on which particular direction the wind happens to be blowing at any given cultural moment. So in a postmodern sort of understanding of the denial of any claims to objective truth, well, that's what you get as a result as it relates to morality. You can apply that to other spheres of truth. But in the moral sphere, what you've got is morality is nothing more than one's own emotive response due to the socio, biological sort of development that human beings undergo within their culture. Devin. Yeah, that's a good question, Devin. And I think if I could summarize or paraphrase your question, what he's basically asking is what kind of obligation the Christian has at the end of the day to reconcile the existence of God and the manifest examples of evil in one's experience. And I do think that is very appropriate. But I think where that belongs primarily is within the context of the in-house debate and discussion of fellow Christian believers who already acknowledge and understand that apart from God, there can be no evil. But there's the further theological endeavor as we're trying to make sense of the scriptural data and other relevant data on the issue for us to explore the various examples of defenses and theodicies that theologians and philosophers of religion and others develop in trying to help us get our mind wrapped around what morally sufficient reasons God might in fact have for permitting evil to exist on the various levels that exist. And that's a theological endeavor. That's for us as believers who want to better understand who God is and how he relates to the world and to us. particularly in our times of distress and great suffering. We want at that very personal level and spiritual level to grow in our understanding of why God permits these things to happen. And so I think what you're speaking to there is a very worthwhile endeavor that Christians ought to pursue. Thank you all. Thank you all.
Tertullian, in his prescription against the heretics, argued, he said, you all keep using the Bible. The Bible belongs to the church. You can't use the Bible. I think what Dr. Kuhn has said is, you all keep using this word evil. Evil has no meaning outside the context of a Christian worldview and a theistic perspective. So thank you so much for that presentation. We're going to take a break. We'll come back at 7:20. So that gives us about 15 minutes. So plenty of refreshments. Please avail yourself of those. If you have not yet had an opportunity to sign in, please do so. We'd like to keep a record of your attendance. We'll see you back momentarily.